It's no surprise that new champions in League have a tendency to cause trouble well after they're added to the game. Around the release of Camille is when I'd argue the term balanced nightmare truly began to surface in day-to-day conversation among the player base, which has only gotten worse as Riot has become more ambitious, or should I say more reckless, with their game design. After much of 2020 and 2021's gauntlet of 200 years, the community was graced with a refreshingly tame champion in the form of Vex, whose moveset harmoniously married the modern design standards of the game with a modicum of reasonable scope. I almost remember the sigh of relief coming from hundreds of thousands of players when they discovered you could fit Vex's entire kit into almost a single page. When Zeri was released, optimism held steady. While on paper there was a lot of complexity in her ability descriptions, the basic premise behind her was easy to figure out, even if there were a few extraneous elements that raised a few eyebrows. All in all, the court of public opinion's first impression of her was cautiously favorable, emphasis on cautious. Upon release, Zeri was strong, very strong. Not only did she start with possibly the highest win rate on her maiden voyage in the history of the game, but she was often seen in top and mid lane alongside bot lane, finding equal dominance in every field. An explosive start, but not something that couldn't be addressed by reductions in numbers. Yet for some unfathomable reason, instead of going down the route of simply nerfing her stats, Riot would try to take some of her lost power budget and funnel it back into her, leading to one of the most tumultuous balance nightmares of all time. Ever since her debut in version 12.2, Zeri has undergone not one, not two, not three, but 4 gameplay updates in the span of half a year. What happened? Where did everything go wrong? That's what we're going to investigate in today's video, so let's find out if Zeri is League's worst balance nightmare to date. Just a moment though, I actually have something rather interesting for you guys. It's a sponsor, but one of the most unique ones I've ever been offered. This video is sponsored by Southern New Hampshire University. SNHU has one of the largest accredited non-profit online degree offerings in the country, with over 200 programs focused on getting you started in or advancing in a career of your interest. Specifically for today, they're pitching their game development program to anyone interested in pursuing a video game related field for their career. You get to learn how to create dynamic, realistic gameplay experiences with AI, game physics, 2D and 3D graphics, and interface design, as well as learn computer programming languages like C++, C#, and Java. For game dev enthusiasts out there, you also get to learn how to use the Unreal Engine, which is one of the premier game engines used by AAA developers and indie studios alike. The courses are taught by industry experts and are extremely flexible in terms of class times. You can decide when you want to work and where. Speaking of flexibility, SNHU lets you transfer up to 90 credits. So for those of you who started college and never finished, you don't have to go back to square one. If you're interested in learning more, feel free to check out the link on screen, which is also in the description. I'm not gonna lie, pretty surprised to be sponsored by a university, but I mean hey, I did game design and development for my undergrad, so I'm a big supporter of these programs. Thanks again to SNHU for sponsoring the video, but for now, let's get back into it. In my first impression series regarding new champions, I often get comments from viewers criticizing me for jumping to conclusions on how they will turn out on live servers when there's no empirical data to reinforce or disavow the implications of their abilities. And my response to that is, that's exactly what first impressions are. One's initial perceptions. It's not dependent on the results and evidence of something, it's how you first think and feel about something or someone. In this scenario, a champion, and my first impressions of Zeri were, like I'd imagine most people, decent. Not great, but not bad either. The running trend among new releases is to address something missing. That was the vibe I got from Vex, Zeri, Renata, and to some extent Nila. Bel'Veth, not so much. Zeri attempted to expand on the idea of a Castor Temple marksman, an AD carry who places greater emphasis on usage of abilities for most of their damage instead of traditional auto attacks, as demonstrated by Burst Fire, effectively transforming her auto attacks into a skill shot that strikes in a flurry much like how Ashe does via Ranger's Focus. Naturally, this raised a lot of interesting questions. How would critical strikes and on-hit effects be involved in all of this? And since it technically counts as an ability, how are relevant properties like Spellblade taken into consideration? Adding on to that, how would that translate to the rest of her design? That uncertainty definitely played into the greater complexity of Zeri's gameplay. She was tapping into a concept that was always present in the game, but never in her intended way. What separates Burst Fire from Ezreal's Mystic Shot, for instance, is that the former is quite literally meant to be her basic attack. Her actual basic attacks deal magic damage and do not apply on-hit effects or critically strike. They apply spell effects instead. Regardless, the general idea of each of her abilities was intuitive to understand. Living Battery, Burst Fire, Ultra Shock Laser, Spark Surge, and Lightning Crash, every one of her abilities are straightforward, albeit with a lot of clarity text. Even now, despite all that's happened, Zeri is by and large a very simple champion at her core. So what was the causality of the incessant amount of changes, buffs, and nerfs she's been getting? To better interpret this, let's go through her various builds, starting with the first. Aware that Burst Fire had more privileges than standard auto attack, players wasted no time exploring the limits of what she could pull off, and the first result was predictably an on-hit based build. Trinity Force, Titanic Hydra, Black Cleaver, and Runon's Hurricane. Triforce was self-explanatory. Burst Fire would give a short burst of movement speed, increase your base attack damage, and proc Spellblade. As for Titanic Hydra and Black Cleaver, what made them so effective on her was that Burst Fire counted as 7 rounds, culminating into roughly a little more than a standard auto attack in damage. But that meant any application-based effects, like the Armor Shot on Black Cleaver, would apply 7 times, allowing her to instantly get full stacks from one use of her Q. Titanic Hydra would also dish out 7 weights of damage, causing her to apply the Black Cleaver stacks to everyone in the line of fire. Then of course, if you took into account the health from those 3 items, Zeri had damage and durability put together, on top of her overtuned numbers at that time. This was where the first issue regarding her balance originated. It was unclear whether or not Zeri's own attributes had more of an impact on her overperformance or the specific build path she was using, so the more logical option was to target her base parameters first. Version 12.4 oversaw nerfs across her entire kit, but you can already pinpoint some hesitance in giving her outright nerfs. 2 things. Her uncharged basic attack damage was lowered considerably, but she was partially compensated in the bonus damage towards low health enemies. Meanwhile, Burst Fire lost some base damage, but the attack speed to damage conversion was increased by a slight amount. This kind of nerfs but not actually mentality would affect the rest of her changes going forward. A red flag I noticed from this change was that, unlike previous champions where the balanced team would decrease their effective power so as to place more of an emphasis on skill expression to make up the deficit, Zeri, while she appears to be undergoing the same process, was by all accounts overtuned. Her numbers were blatantly way too high. You don't get a 54% win rate in 3 separate roles from players being good at the champion, especially not when she's been out for less than a month. The general rule of thumb for using performance metrics is for champions with a pick rate of no more than 10% and or a ban rate of no more than 20% to stay between a 48 to 52% win rate. For reference, in version 12.13 across all ranks, Darius is shown to have a 10% pick rate, 30% ban rate, and a 50% win rate on the dot. The ban rate is mildly high, but overall he's in a healthy spot. Zeri was nowhere near the appropriate range of 48 to 52, so there wasn't a reason for any compensatory buffs whatsoever. For that patch, they just needed to lower her numbers and give her another 2 weeks to see how things are going. It may not seem all that important, and truthfully those particular changes weren't, but like I said before, it set a dangerous precedent for how they were approaching her balance. In the next patch, more nerfs had to be given to her baseline. Lower base stats, max health damage, a longer cooldown on Spark Surge, and less movement speed on Lightning Crash. But they gave her more base damage on her Q, if even a little, and more overcharged stacks when hitting champions. Again, there's that resistance towards directly lowering her power ceiling. Moving into 12.7 is when you start seeing this pop up to greater effect. Zeri's base stats were further lowered, her base damage on Q and W were lowered, and her cooldowns were increased on her E and Ultimate. In exchange, Burst Fire gained more total AD ratio, Ultra Shock Laser gained more hyper scaling, Spark Surge refunds faster when landing crits, and Lightning Crash gains an extra stack with crits as well. I can understand the idea around these changes. Up until that point, AD Bruiser was still the premier build path on Zeri thanks to the healthy balance of damage and durability, relying mostly on her base numbers and stats to carry her the rest of the way. You'll notice that almost all nerfs to her were towards her base numbers, lower stats, longer cooldowns, lower damage, etc. The addition of crit related bonuses were to encourage building her like any other marksman, and it worked. But there needed to be an adjustment period given that players could no longer rely on the cushion of survivability from her usual items. But Riot wasted no time backpedaling on some of those buffs through a hotfix on 12.7, refunding a lot of base numbers and adding some extra scaling to her kit, before doubling down on it later on by restoring even more of her base numbers. Thing is, at the time, it was perfectly reasonable for them to pull their punches. 12.10 was the durability update, and it shook things up a lot. Zeri was hit harder than other marksmen due to her reliance on death by 1,000 cuts. Her win rate dropped below 46%, with her pick rate collapsing by an equally large margin. One of 2 possibilities was evident here. Either they went too hard on nerfing the base numbers and Zeri was objectively weak, or players still had yet to overcome the notion that she was difficult to play at a high level, and the only reason they were whooping ass before was because she was overtuned. No matter the case, Riot appeared to be trying too hard to steady the wheel when more likely than not it would have evened out on its own. Some may try to argue that since Zeri had such a dominating presence in the meta, they had no choice but to do something, and at the start that was true. When you have a 54% win rate across 3 different roles and almost a 30% pick rate, it doesn't take 200 years of collective game design experience to know that maybe Zeri's broken. Riot was releasing full page-length balance changes for her almost every month, requiring players to reinvent and refigure how to play her since remember she started Bruiser then went to crit. And now we arrive at version 12.11. Yet again, a complete overhaul to her playstyle that gave rise to another build, probably the most degenerate of all. The patch itself featured an extensive list of buffs for her across the board, but the most noteworthy one was to Ultra Shock Laser. It lost more of the slow but got more AD scaling and a lower cooldown, as well as the ability to deal 75% bonus damage when using the wall explosion, while reducing Spark Surge's cooldown and gaining stacks of Lightning Crash. Along with the minor adjustments to the rest of her kit, these were big changes, massive buffs for her, questionably so. A free unconditional 75% bonus damage on landing the wall version, just like that. Considering how much range it has when doing this, players connected the dots really quickly to find out that it's essentially the same as AP Kaisa back then. Only Zeri's W could damage multiple enemies. Lo and behold, first strike AP Zeri was born. Muramana, Luden's Tempest, and Shadowflame. Spam the crap out of W over and over again. If you go back and look at the Mountain No changes preceding 12.11, Ultra Shock Laser was often the recipient of those compensation buffs. If you look at a W on release, it did 40 to 180 base plus 100% total AD and 60% AP magic damage. If you look at Ultra Shock Laser as a 12.11, it did 10 to 150 base plus 150% total AD and 70% AP magic damage times 1.75 if you got the wall laser, easily doing more than double what it used to. With the other parts of her kit heavily nerfed, placing the onus on mechanical execution, players saw the W change to be a veritable cop-out for the time being, leading to her popularity and win rate skyrocketing once again, but for an altogether different reason. Running ability power would still maintain enough DPS outside of Ultra Shock thanks to her basic attacks and Lightning Crash, more specifically the basic attacks dealing increased damage against enemies below 35% health. Zeri's game plan was distorted from a high-tempo kiting playstyle in the same vein as Callista to a poke mage like Xerath or Ziggs, using her superior neutral game to gradually whittle down enemies before going in for the kill once they all got low. The results of this strategy were so effective it transformed her win rate from 45% to 52% virtually overnight, among, the other stuff as well. Just like that, immediate hotfixes once again, rolling back about half of the buffs they gave her. Unsurprisingly, Zeri was unfazed by the changes because the real reason she was doing so well at that point in time was her AP build with Ultra Shock Laser, which they would have figured out if they simply waited to collect more information. Nevertheless, patch 12.12 targeted her W's incredible scaling, but they didn't do anything to change the 75% bonus crit damage, so she was still broken. Finally, we arrive at 12.14. The other part of AP Zeri's power was removed as well. The 6 times bonus damage was changed into a similar effect that basically got rid of the champion interaction, finally crippling AP Zeri but leaving her in shambles just like she was before the whole ordeal beginning 12.11. First, we had Bruiser on Zeri, which was understandably taken out of commission as it's awful to deal with someone with 800 movement speed and over 300 health. Then we had Crit Zeri, the healthiest of her builds, to me anyway, since it appeared to be the one that her philosophy was intended to require. But her numbers were still over the top. Even though her win rate was dropping rapidly, a lot of that was inertial. Players had to adjust to a character who would change completely from one patch to another. You had one side, the player base, attempting to find some semblance of stability and comprehension amidst all this volatility, which made the balance team believe the champion was too confusing to figure out, so they would perform a mini rework on her in the hopes that would simplify her, which would result in the player base having to drop everything and theory craft all over again right when they were on the verge of locating a definitive point for her in the meta, repeating the cycle again and again and again. Her omnipresence in pro play only exacerbated this, as Riot now had to deal with her fluctuating performance and solo queue on top of that. In my humble opinion, all of this could have been avoided if they just took it slow and balanced her conservatively rather than sliding in these tiny compensation buffs and then forgetting about them when they tried to buff her like crazy, thus overbuffing her. Several years ago, Double made a compelling video on the problems of the meta that is so volatile. While this ensures that nothing ever gets stale, it also runs a risk of action being taken to address something when it's too early for there to be any conclusive evidence. It takes time. It takes millions of games worth of data before you can truly decide if X champion needs a buff or a nerf. In all honesty, her original design was perfectly fine. It was absolutely overtuned to all hell, but from a thematic and conceptual standpoint, it was fine. Burst Fire was fine, Ultra Shock Laser was fine, Spark Surge was fine, Lightning Crash was fine, Living Battery was fine. What they just needed to do was delicately reduce her numbers. They didn't have to make one ability really weak and make another one really strong. They didn't have to give Ultra Shock Laser 75% bonus damage when hitting walls. They didn't have to give crit strike bonuses on Spark Surge. In my eyes, all they had to do was lower her numbers to where you could no longer get away with building low damage high durability items like Black Cleaver Titanic Hydra and be forced to go crit. Perhaps a slight adjustment in that direction was necessary, but the bottom line is, Zeri didn't need these hyper ambitious changes to be leveled out. Everything that happened with her is a clear case of trying to do too much and making things worse. I was really optimistic about Zeri's design when she was announced. She was the first tempo-based marksman in League of Legends, and also the first accelerating marksman too. I remember when I saw Lightning Crash have an infinite stacking mechanic, I was curious to see what she would be able to do in the hands of a good player. Unfortunately, the phrase good player entails professional, which no doubt skewed the balance team's perceptions on how strong Zeri really was. God, I hate how pro play ruins perfectly good champions. Actually no, roleplay wasn't even the issue. What was the purpose of 12.11 Zeri? She was doing just fine prior to the Ultra Shock laser change. If you took version 12.11, got rid of the basic attack and W section, and just gave her the Q, E, and ultimate buffs, that was all you needed to do. Ultra Shock laser was already a very strong attack thanks to the buffs to its scaling. I get that you were trying to incentivize going crit, but that incentive was already there. Yes, her win rate went down from the durability update, so then gently nudge her numbers back up to compensate. You don't have to do anything crazy, Riot. Okay, I'm gonna stop because I'm starting to tilt and I'm ranting right now. Case in point, they tried to do too much with Zeri instead of letting the players figure things out on their own. Maybe there's something that happened between 12.7 and 12.11 that I'm not aware of. Either way, it's without question that she's the game's worst balance nightmare since Akali a few years back. But unlike Akali, Zeri's balance nightmare was entirely preventable if they just waited to pull the trigger on balancing her again. So what do you guys think? Do you agree or disagree with my stance on her? Feel free to share in the comments down below. I'm actually kinda curious about the prevailing sentiment surrounding the past 8 months with her. If you enjoyed the video though, a rating would be much appreciated. Consider following me on Twitter at Vars, joining my Discord server, and checking out my other discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.